Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. Today our guest is Brenda Bentley, author of River Walks Ann Arbor. Welcome to the show, Brenda.
Thank you.
I love this book. When we first moved here, somebody gave it to us, and I have been reading it, coming back to it ever since. It's so interesting in terms of the history of the area, the natural history. It's just chock full of information.
I hope it's helpful to people. It was a fun project to do.
Good. And it covers so much territory, and of course we don't have time to cover it all today, so we're going to focus on the environmental aspects. And we're also going to limit ourselves geographically a little bit to the Argo area of the Huron River, because there's just so much to say about that area. So to get started, you mentioned the oak openings. What are they?
There's a lot of different kinds of oak forests. There's oak hickory forest, there's mixed oak forest, and there's oak barren, or at least that's the term that we see on the Pioneer maps. And that just means a lot of open space around the oak trees, or maybe just oak trees that are close together but not scrunched together and have no understory.
So it was when they say openings, it was a more open feel, more vistas. How did it stay open and not get all brushy?
Fire.
Oh, yeah?
Oaks resist fire, or even if the tree itself is burned by the fire, the roots survive. They have very long, deep roots. That's why we find them on our high hills in Ann Arbor. But the fire would then burn off the competing species.
Okay. And when the colonists came, they suppressed the fires. So.
Well, it became policy after 1920. Perhaps they were allowing it before 1920, but after 1920 it became government policy, and that's when we started seeing the maples overtake the beautiful oaks.
Oh, okay. And back before the Europeans did a lot of things to the river, you mentioned in your book that the groundwater was 12 feet higher. How did that affect the river in terms of transportation for the Native Americans?
You know, I'm not sure if the actual river level went down. It did in places, but it's the groundwater under the ground that really dropped. You know, the groundwater level follows the terrain, so if you've got a big hill, the groundwater will also rise under that, even though that's a much higher level than the nearby rivers and lakes. But yes, the settlers had to dig ditches everywhere because there were so many marshes and swamps. And so they did drain a lot of the land, and that did take the water table down.
Because I read a book about the early Native Americans, that they were able to use even the tributaries for transportation, and that nowadays it's so flashy, the water level goes up and down. So.
It's flashy.
Yeah. It's
flashy, you're right. Normally the ground is supposed to be like a sponge, and the water levels are all supposed to stay quite constant even after a heavy rainfall.
And the settlers utilized Indian trails. I saw a map that showed so many Indian trails intersecting. In fact, I think it might be in here, intersecting in the Argo area. Tell us, where were the Indian trails mostly in terms of the topography?
They were densely laced all over the state, and when you see those trail maps, I believe those don't even include all the trails. In general, the trails would follow the sides, the banks of both banks of every river, and plus they would go to important points, like Saline was a source of salt for the Native Americans. Wow. Yes. And there were various village points. Over 10,000 years there were lots of different cultures of Indians, but at least the most recent ones had many village sites, many planting areas, farm sites, and burial sites, and seasonal hunting places around the state. So they had trails everywhere, plus they heavily used their canoes, you're right, even on the tributaries.
And there's that boulder down by the Broadway Bridge. What's that say on there? Something about
that was a fording place where you have two outwash plains coming together. It would be a nice wide part of the river, very shallow, so it would be a good fording place. And that's what you find there.
I wondered, I was trying to think, how did they get across it? Did they have a bridge? But they didn't, they just walked across.
Oh yes, just walk through the water. It would be low enough to walk through.
Huh. And I know that once the colonists came, the area the Argo area became heavily industrialized. I guess that's not the word. But tell us how that got started. I think the first one was Anson Brown's mill, right?
There was a sawmill before Anson Brown.
Oh, really?
Anson Brown built his in about 1829, 1830, 1832. You see different dates. But John Allen arrived in 1824 and got someone immediately to build a sawmill on the downtown side of the river.
Okay.
And right at the foot of today's State Street. There was a sawmill there and a race. But anyway, the millers were the first to flood in when the territory was opened to American settlers. And these were knowledgeable millers who came in knowing that there would be a lot of settlers and they would need boards and they would need flour and so forth. And they built mills just wherever there was a good spot in the river to capture the water energy.
And apparently between Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, the grade is pretty good.
Yes, the Huron River is about 128 miles long, but where it cuts through the moraines between Dexter and Ypsilanti, it falls the most. So you have a gradual fall from the headwater region up near Pontiac. That's how far away the headwaters of the Huron are. And then it makes a 90-degree turn at Dexter and cuts through the moraines and then goes on down to the Lake Erie outfall. But through the moraines, which is Dexter to Ypsilanti, the fall ratio is about 8 feet per mile, whereas the whole river only falls about 600 feet from the headwaters to Lake Erie. So that's the best fall ratio. So that's what you need. You need a big fall. You need the water to fall a lot, like 12 feet or as much as you can make it, to get a good wheel in there and capture some power.
And I guess that's why they built the mill race where the Cascades are now, to increase the difference?
Yes. So they built the dam to hold back the pond. That's the one we still have today, Argo Pond. And so that was their supply of water. You dam it and hold it because you don't want it fluctuating. And then to increase the fall ratio, if your topography gives you that option, usually your mill might be right there at the dam, but you can also volitionally, optionally, make a mill race downriver, downstream a little bit. And whereas the river is continuing down, your mill race holds the water at the same level as the pond, and then you build your mill, and then you've got an even greater fall than you would have back at the dam.
The springs of the area were important for some types of industry, right?
Well, fresh water, and so making beer would require fresh water, so we do find a lot of breweries which would at least need access to a spring and perhaps be located near a spring.
Because isn't there a brewery up by Jones Street, or a former brewery?
That's right, and there was a spring there. That's right.
So by the brewery, there's also Arbor Springs now, the company. So I guess those springs are still functioning, right?
Yes, probably so. There are places where there's actually houses built on top of the point where the pioneer maps show that there was a spring. And that always makes me wonder what the heck they did to plug the spring. Because, you know, these artesian springs are under pressure to bubble up. And they're usually at the foot of a hill. They're not usually at a high elevation. They're usually at a point where you kind of imagine the hill kind of pressing down on the underground aquifer.
Boy, you know so much about the geology. That's really interesting. I never thought of that.
I learned a lot in the process. It was one of the great pleasures of the project.
And another thing about that area, the Argo area, there's a lot of railroads. Now, why are there so many railroads in that area? Tracks, I mean.
Well, you know, when the pioneers came, they had no idea what was around the corner, power-wise, industry-wise. All they'd ever had for 1,000 years was water power and oxen. And then all of a sudden, after they settled Ann Arbor, just within 2 decades, you've got the invention of railroads. And immediately, being a very happening place, Ann Arbor got the railroad. Well, all of Michigan got the railroad. And because it came to supply the industries, to take away the goods of the farmers, so the farmers became wealthy, selling their meat and their apples. But the railroads went right along the river. That was the best place to build the railroad because it was too much work to cut into the moraine to make the railroad go through the moraine, because you have to keep the grade as steady as possible. And so they'd follow the river or a creek to get the most level or easiest grade possible.
That's interesting. And I was up north last weekend. We went to Frankfort, and there was the Ann Arbor Railroad they kept mentioning. And so when I came home, I looked up why would the Ann Arbor Railroad go through to Frankfort, and it turns out they had car ferries to Wisconsin from there. And so here, I live right next to the railroad that went to Frankfort, and amazing that you could go all the way from there to Wisconsin. It boggles my mind. It's exciting too to think what it was like back then.
Yes, and the man who built the Ann Arbor Railroad was an ardent abolitionist, as was
really?
John Allen, the founder of Ann Arbor.
Oh.
So
yeah, you have a lot on that in there. That's another whole interesting topic. And there were a lot of ice houses on Argo Pond, you said. Why is that?
Well, it was just another one of the industries. People used everything around them. They used the trees and the ice and the fields, whatever they could, the animals, the pelts. But anyway, Argo Pond was clean because right down there at the Broadway Bridge, you had that became the industrial area. But they would harvest ice in the winter, the winters that were cold enough to freeze over. And an ice house was simply a barn, a wooden barn, not even chinked. It probably had cracks in it. But they would cover the ice blocks with sawdust, which was very insulating, and it kept all throughout the next summer.
And I read somewhere that the ice was a good complement to the meat industry because you need to keep the meat cold, and there was apparently a lot of different things going on in that area related to meat.
Well, this area was completely covered by farms, and people were growing a lot of sheep.
So there were tanneries apparently down by the Broadway Bridge.
Yes.
Were tanneries and slaughterhouses.
Yes, yes. They were producing leather, they were processing meat. Typically the animals were put live onto the trains. There was a big slaughterhouse down in Cincinnati and of course out in Chicago that developed, that grew up the same time Ann Arbor was growing up. So you read a lot about live animals put in those corrals right next to North Main Street where the new center is now, and then just being put on the trains. And you see photographs of the chutes that the animals were loaded up into the cars on, and then they would be transported to these other places. But yeah, we did have tanneries down there, right there in Riverside Park. They created quite a mess, evidently.
Yeah. And there's that picture of the Bluffs nature area that's got cows grazing in it and stuff.
A lot of cows, a lot of milk, a lot of milk and
I guess the
cheese.
Northside Grill used to be a dairy.
Yes, a lot of dairies that supplied just people in their local neighborhoods. So there'd be a lot of dairies drawn by horses delivering the milk.
So we've talked about industry. We didn't actually even mention the hydroelectric dams, which is, well, let's do that. We can't miss that.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. During the 19th century, the millers came in, the early 19th century, and they dammed the river in many, many places. And then steam was developed, and so you could run your mills away from the water, and you could operate them by coal. But the power companies evolved to take over the mill sites. And then we had lots of local small power companies like Washtenaw Light and Power, and this was true of all the riverside communities throughout Michigan. But then you had this monopolization of all industries, including the power industries, along through the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so Detroit Edison bought up all the mill sites and started building great big technologically advanced turbine dams that would generate electricity. Electricity was new, of course, in the 19th century from Edison, another Michigan boy.
Okay, so that pretty much covers industry, and we're running out of time sort of already, so let's quickly get into recreational uses of the river. For instance, this is really interesting, your book about the boulevard system. Can you tell us what, like Longshore and Cedar Bend? And
Well, we are so blessed to have these hills in Ann Arbor. We've got these moraines, these glacial moraines. They're hills, piles of glacial till. So that gives us the ability to climb up a hill 200 feet above the river and look down on the river. And we want to see the river or the town or something. We want to see the view. So as soon as, you know, those first couple of decades, people were busy getting the town established. But then as soon as that started settling out, we had this, throughout the whole country, the City Beautiful movement, and everybody everywhere around the country was trying to do this sort of thing, making viewpoints and beautifying their cities with beautiful trees and whatnot. So Ann Arbor, always doing what was on the leading edge of everything, created a plan for boulevards and parks. And it wasn't ever fully finished, but part of it was. And a boulevard was simply a beautiful road where people could walk and see the view. And Longshore Drive, which they called North Boulevard, it was one of their many boulevards planned, we still possess as Longshore Drive. And,
which is a beautiful drive.
Yes.
And what I noticed recently when I was reading here was fascinating to me, that they had originally planned that it would go across the river and connect with the Allen Creek Boulevard, which hasn't happened yet, but as you pointed out, they hope it'll happen.
Yes,
So
so many things I came across that were good ideas even 150 years ago are still sitting there perking.
Huh.
And hopefully we will see them come to fruition. But you know, that Longshore Drive also went all the way to Barton Hills in the planning stage.
Oh.
And so that would have been another viewpoint. And Bird Hills.
Which brings me to the connections. You have good information in here about how there were more connections, there were more ways to get to the river as a pedestrian. For instance, there's connections under the 3 bridges at Fuller waiting for, can you tell us about that?
Well, this is just a long-term plan. Even back in the 70s, the Bicycle Club and many people proposed that we have a path along the river, all the way along the river, perhaps the whole 128 miles of the river, but at least the whole length of Ann Arbor.
Mm-hmm.
And we've come far since we acquired from Detroit Edison a lot of that land that they used to control. So we've got a wonderful pathway all along Gallup and up to Fuller, but we still don't have connecting to those cement platforms under the Fuller Road Bridge, which was built in the 60s. But people have been walking beside the river since before the railroad was put in 1837. So, and we still want to walk along the river.
And right now, it's homeless people are living on those connections.
Those are
underneath
nice,
the bridges.
clean platforms, or at least
For
clean
tents.
of brush. Anyway,
Yeah.
they're concrete platforms with
Huh.
roof, so it's a great place to camp.
Yeah. And you mentioned the railroads. Apparently, there used to be people who would walk along the railroads for fun, and now we can't. And we can't cross them in a lot of places.
Well, CSX, which is the east-west one, the one that runs along the Huron River, which is perpendicular to the Ann Arbor Railroad, the one that goes to Frankenmuth, and comes
Frankfurt.
up Frankfurt. Okay,
Yep.
and comes up from Toledo. So they're at right angles to each other. Is very, very jealous of its land. It doesn't want anybody to cross it. But when it was first built, it would have been laughable if you told people, don't cross the railroad. Because of course you crossed the railroad if you came to it and needed to get to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
But now they have a beautiful crossing at Gallup Park, proving that they can have beautiful crossings. But they have a rule that they only have to have one per 20 miles or one per 100 miles, whatever it is. They've got some criteria there that they maintain, and they don't like anybody to cross their railroad at any other point. And they're rather threatening. I've heard I've heard stories of heavy fines. So if you do cross the railroad, look both ways twice. Don't stand there and wave to the engineer. You know, just get yourself across.
Which makes me think of that dirt path that goes from State Street down the hill to Broadway Park.
Yes.
Which is terribly dangerous. I mean, it's creepy and everything. But I mean, you make the point in the book that State Street used to go all the way down to the river.
That was
which
the
makes
State Street
perfect
right-of-way. State Street right-of-way. I don't know when State Street ever gave up that right-of-way. And also, right where it touches the river was where the first sawmill was that we mentioned earlier. But that is still used by pedestrians. They do have to cross the railroad like deviants, you know. And of course, everybody in the Gandy Dancer can see them crossing.
But you know, that Broadway Park is a beautiful little park.
Yes, it is.
But it doesn't get used because there's no way to get to it.
There's no way to get to
except for from the Broadway Bridge, which doesn't have much pedestrian traffic at all.
This is our biggest problem. The north side of the river has perfect access to this beautiful Argo Pond and the river, but the downtown side and the North Main side has the big problem of the railroad. It's a very big barrier. It's a very unfortunate, big, major barrier.
Yeah. Well, we have just a minute or two left. I want to read something that I love from your book. It's a quote. I don't know what page it's on, but it says, "Objects from the past remind us that we're standing on the shoulders of others." And that's what I love about your book, because there's so much that's gone on in Ann Arbor, so many amazing things that you just don't know unless you read your book.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
you know, maybe you could just comment on that kind of thing in terms of your thoughts for the future.
Well, environmentally, I just love that we used to have a swimming beach at Argo Pond,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I am waiting for us to have one again in the future. We need to get into the water. We
Yeah.
want to get into the water. And the other thing is the fact that we had these wonderful oak groves and oak openings, and now we're letting maples, in some cases in many neighborhoods, take over. And it would be great to promote our oaks more. And the other thing is our viewpoints. We need to preserve our viewpoints. Maybe some judicious pruning, not only of the buckthorn, but also of some other trees. When you get up to a high point like the top of Cedar Bend, you want to be able to see something from way up there, or Longshore Drive.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that hundreds of people would go to Cedar Bend every Sunday or whatever to promenade, and
Yes.
now it's so dense you can hardly see, well, you can't see the river from up there at all.
Except
And
in the
nobody
winter,
goes there
yeah.
because it's creepy. If it's very
Yes,
dense,
yes.
it's kind of scary.
Yes, at least if we could open windows. And also in my book, I point out that the Arboretum does this very successfully. They open windows along those roads that run down both sides of the glen, so that you can enjoy that beautiful open space, the glen. The juxtaposition of the deep forest and the open glen, which is just like the openness of the pond, Argo Pond, and the forest bluffs on the sides. It's the same artistic paradigm, and we just want to see from that.
It nourishes the soul.
Yes.
Well, this has been wonderful. How can people get more information on your book?
Oh, my website will tell a little bit more about the book. citywalks.us. But you know, on the topics that we've been talking about, all this history, the library's site is full of historical photographs, and it tells the history of Ann Arbor very well.
So that would be aadl.org, is that what it is? Yep, aadl.org. Oh, there's a site called The Making of Ann Arbor.
Yes.
So I think that web address is moaa.aadl.org.
That's right. It's attached to
and
the
that has
library.
a lot of interesting maps and photos. This book has lots, but that site has even more.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Brenda. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
For an online archive of today's show, go to ewashna.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.